Wait, wait. Ini mana? Aduh, kok. അതൊക്കെ ഫോക്കസ് ഇന്റർവ്യൂ പ്രൊസീജിയേഴ്സ്. വാട്ട് ന്യൂസ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ സാധനം. വട്ടിച്ചോളോ.
In the hearts of those who dare to heal, a fire ignites, a burning desire to limit the human suffering.
ഡീറ്റെയിൽസ് ആണ്.
really easy to configure and to have global state in your React applications. So Redux has three different concepts and they're all super, super important. The first concept is the concept of a video and you watch it until the end, you're never going to have to watch another video on this ever again. All right.
No.
All right, cool. We're now on my computer and we can begin. The first thing that I want to do
We'll guide you through how to use split screen or split view on your Mac. If you find this guide useful, then please consider staying because you can have two windows on your Mac at once. Firstly, you want to open up the applications you want to do this with. So I want to go and open up Safari and Pages. So let me open them up like so. I just had them minimized. And then what you want to do is go to the top left of the application to the red, orange and green option. And then what you want to do is hover over the green option or click and hold. And you should then go and see these three options here. So what you want to do is click on tile to the left or tile to the right. So I'll click on tile to the left for this one, like so. And then it's going to go and show you the applications you can go and split the other half of the screen with. So because I had Pages open, I can go and select it. And then just like that, we've
really easy to configure and to have global state in your React applications. So Redux, and you watch it until the end. You're never going to have to watch another video on this ever again. All right, cool. We're now on my computer and we can begin. The first thing that I want to do is just spend a couple of minutes, not too long, just talking about Redux as a whole and also talking about the three main concepts of Redux, the store, actions, and reducers. And then we are going to build a simple application using Redux Toolkit so that you get to see how all of the different pieces come together and also how easy it is to work with modern Redux using Redux Toolkit. All right, so let's talk about Redux. Redux is essentially a state management library that allows you to have global state. In the context of React, what this means is that you can have state that is accessible from any component, no matter where they are in the tree. This is why it's called a state management library, and it makes it really, really easy to configure and to have global state in your React applications. So Redux has three different concepts and they're all super, super important. The first concept is the concept of a store. So I'm just going to write store here. how all of the different pieces come together, and also how easy it is to work with modern Redux using Redux Toolkit. Alright, so let's talk about Redux. Redux is essentially a state management library that allows you to have global state. In the context of React, what this means is that you can have state that is accessible from any component no matter where they are in the tree. This is why it's called a state management library, and it makes it really easy to configure and to have global state in your React applications. So Redux has three different concepts, and they're all super important. The first concept is the concept of a store. So I'm just going to write store here, store. The store is essentially state. It is the global state that, as I've just mentioned, is going to be accessible across any component no matter where they are in your React application. The store, you get to define it in any way that you want. You can put whatever you want in there. It's completely up to you and the needs of the application. And Redux with Redux Toolkit will allow you to easily set this up and then connect it to your React application. Now, the store will usually be made up of multiple slices of the state, each responsible for a certain domain in the application. For example, let's say that we had a counter application. We would have a counter slice of our state, which would hold the pieces of state that are specifically related to the counter. So for example, we could do something like interface and then counter state, and we can define whatever state we want for this counter. For example, we could do value, and that is going to be of type number. We would have a slice of our state called the counter state, which would hold the value of our count, which is of type number, and then that would be one part of our Redux state. Then we could maybe have another piece of our state, for example, interface, and then we can do user state with a capital. And that will hold all of the pieces of state for our user. For example, is signed in, right? Is the user currently signed in? Is the user currently signed out? Now, of course, I'm grossly oversimplifying this. In a real application, you would have a lot more than this. But the point is that your state, your global store in Redux, is going to be made up of multiple slices, and they all come together to form one global state that is going to be accessible in your steps, and they're all super state, and we can define whatever state we want across any component that allows you to have global state. In the context of React, what this means is that you can have state that is accessible from any component no matter where they are in the tree. This is why it's called a state management library, and it makes it really easy to configure and to have global state in your React applications. So Redux has three different concepts, and they're all super important. The first concept is the concept of a store. So I'm just going to write store here, store. The store is essentially state. It is the global state that, as I've just mentioned, is going to be accessible across any component no matter where they are in your React application. The store, you get to define it in any way that you want. You can put whatever you want in there. It's completely up to you and the needs of the application. And Redux with Redux Toolkit will allow you to easily set this up and then connect it to your React application. Now, the store will usually be made up of multiple slices of the state, each responsible for a certain domain in the application. For example, let's say that we had a counter application. We would have a counter slice of our state, which would hold the pieces of state that are specifically related to the counter. So for example, we could do something like interface and then counter state, and we can define whatever state we want for this counter. For example, we could do value, and that is going to be of type number. We would have a slice of our state called the counter state, which would hold the value of our count, which is of type number, and then that would be one part of our Redux state. Then we could maybe have another piece of our state, for example, interface, and then we can do user state with a capital, and that will hold all of the pieces of state for our user. For example, is signed in, right? Is the user currently signed in? Is the user currently signed out? Now, of course, I'm grossly oversimplifying this. In a real application, you would have a lot more than this. But the point is that your state, your global store in Redux, is going to be made up of multiple slices, and they all come together to form one global state that is going to be accessible in your entire application. Then the next concept in Redux is the concept of actions. So I'm going to come here and do actions. Actions are essentially what you use to tell Redux what it should do to the state. In the case of our counter state here, we have a value which is of type number, which means that we might have an action to increment the count to make this value +1, and we also might have an action to decrement the count to make this value -1. Actions in Redux have two properties that are super important. So let me just write some code here to illustrate this. This is not like real code, this is pseudocode, just to illustrate you what I mean with this example. I'm going to do const increment. That is going to be equal to an object, which is going to have a type. That type is going to be increment. I'm just going to remove this here. And then we also have payload, which is going to be 1. This is what an action looks like. And let me just do the same thing for a decrement. So I'm just going to come here and do decrement. Now we have two pseudo actions. Remember, this is pseudocode, this is not real code. They have a type, which is always going to be of type string, and this is required. This is essentially the name of this action, right? Redux is going to use this type to determine what it should do to the state. If it receives an action with a type of increment, it'll know that it has to increment the state by 1. If it receives an action with a type of decrement, it'll know that it has to decrement the state by 1. Then we have this payload here, which is the second property of an action. This one is not required. This is optional. The payload is essentially any data that you want to send to Redux in your action so that it can perform its job. Let's say that instead of increment, we had an action that was increment by amount, and we needed a certain amount to increment our state by, our count by. We would use this payload to pass the actual value that we want to increment our state by. That is going to be the payload of this action. But in this case, in the case of increment, we don't actually need a payload because increment really just means increment by 1. So in this specific case, we could just go without this payload. We can just remove it here in both cases because you don't want to increment by anything else other than 1, so you don't actually need a payload. But if you had an action, for example, increment by amount, right, we would then need to have a specific payload because we don't know what amount we want to increment the state by. So in this case, to Redux, we would send a payload, in this case of 10. It can be anything you want. This payload doesn't have to be a number. It's only a number because we're working in our counter state pseudo example, right? But you can literally define your state and your actions in any way, and you can send whatever payload you want. Then we have the third concept in Redux, which is the concept of reducers. Reducers essentially are responsible for taking an action and then depending on the type of the action, will actually go out and make the update in the Redux store. They will use the type of the action to know what updates to do, and optionally, they will use the payload to do those specific actions, to make those specific updates to the Redux store. Now, one very important thing to know about reducers and also to know about Redux in general is the fact that reducers will never directly make an update to the Redux store. We have this concept of immutability, which means that we're never allowed to directly mutate the state. Instead, what reducers are going to do is they're going to take the state, they're going to make a copy of the state, and then make those changes to that copy of the state, which will also have all the other unchanged properties of the state, and then will completely replace the state as a whole with the copy that has the changes applied. We're never going to directly mutate the state. Redux does not work if you mutate the state directly. You always have to follow the concept of immutability, make a copy to the state, make the changes to that copy, and then overwrite the entire state. This is very important because this is how Redux works. Cool, so now with this, we fully understand Redux, we understand the store, actions, and reducers, and how they all work together, which means that we have everything that we need to actually start building our simple application with Redux Toolkit, so that you actually get to see how to implement the store, the actions, and the reducers, and how to connect all of it together easily with Redux Toolkit. So, the first thing that we need to do is we need to create our store. So I'm going to come here to my File Explorer, I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to just keep things very simple. I'm going to call this folder state. So we'll do state, and inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new file, and this one is going to be store.ts. This file is going to hold our Redux store. So what we need to do to create a store is we need to import something from Redux Toolkit. So I'm going to do import configure. Actually, let me just try again. Import configure store, and we have the import right here. We're going to import configure store from Redux.js toolkit, and that is going to allow us to easily create our store. Then
Store action.
And we're going to come here and we're going to do export const store equals configure store. This is going to take a parenthesis and then an object as a parameter. And then this object will only take one key, and that is going to be reducer. And for now, because we don't actually have any reducers, we're just going to give this an empty object. But as soon as we create our different reducers or different slices of our state, as we've seen here, we're going to then come here and connect them using the store so that then they will be accessible across our entire application. And finally, what we need to do, because we are working in TypeScript, we're going to need to export two types that are going to be very useful as we work with all of the different components of Redux and Redux Toolkit in our React application. So already Copilot is being very helpful and knows exactly what I want to export. The first type that I want to export, if I can just do it, is going to be the root state. So this is essentially the return type, which is a TypeScript helper utility of the type of store.getState. So this configure store gives us a store variable here, which has a getState function, and then we can get the return type of that function to have as our root state. So then in any React component, as you're going to see, whenever we need to access the state using a selector, we're going to be able to define the state using this root state type, and then we'll have access in TypeScript to all of our state super easily. Then right below, we're going to export another type, and that is going to be the app dispatch type, which is also going to be very useful. So I'm going to come here and do export type app dispatch, and then of course Copilot knows exactly what I want. This comes from the type of store.dispatch. So we also have another function on the store called dispatch, and we can get the type of that function and then export this as this app dispatch type. You're going to see this is going to come very useful when we're trying to do asynchronous act actions using our use dispatch hook. Cool. So now with this, we've successfully created our Redux store. The next step for us to do is to connect connect this store to React because React by default cannot directly talk to Redux. We have to use a provider from React Redux to then connect our store and our entire Redux application state to React. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to come here in my main file, wherever I'm basically rendering the entire app, and then I'm going to import a provider. If I can type properly, I have a new keyboard, that is why this is a little bit slower. Provider from React Redux, and then also we're going to import our store that we just created. So I'm going to come here and do import store, and that is going to be from .state/store. This is exactly the store that we just created right now. This provider comes directly from React Redux and not from Toolkit, which is what is going to allow us to connect our Redux store to our React application. This provider works with the Redux Context API, which if you're not familiar with it, I do have a whole tutorial video on that you can watch to get yourself API. Or comes directly from React Redux and not from Toolkit, which is what is going to allow us to connect our Redux store to our React application. This provider works with the Redux Context API, which if you're not familiar with it, I do have a whole tutorial video on that you can watch to get yourself up to speed. And essentially, we are going to wrap our entire app with this provider, provide our store to the provider, which is then going to not be the store that we just created right now. This provider comes directly from React Redux and not from Toolkit, which is what is going to allow us to connect our Redux store to our React application. This provider works with the Redux Context API, which if you're not familiar with it, I do have a whole tutorial video on that you can watch to get yourself up to speed. And essentially, we are going to wrap our entire app with this provider, provide our store to the provider, which is then going to allow us to use the store in any React component. So I'm going to come here, make a new line, and then just do provider. I'm going to give it the store here, and then right below the app, I'm just going to make another line and then just close this provider tag and then save. And then actually remove this because this is unneeded. And this is what we need to now connect React to Redux. So we use this provider, we injected it to store using context, which means that now this store is going to be accessible to our entire app and any component, no matter where they are in the tree. It's really, really useful. Now that we have our provider set up, we can actually go and create our first slice of state. So what we're going to build in this tutorial video is going to be a simple counter application.
Demikian.
So we're going to need to create our counter slice. So I'm going to come here in my state folder. I'm going to make a new folder, call this counter. This is going to hold our counter slice. And then I'm going to make a new file and call it counter slice.ts. This file is going to contain everything that we need, anything that is related to our counter slice. Our actions, our reducers, our state, they're all going to go in this file. So the first thing that we need to do, because we are working in TypeScript, we need to define our state. So what I'm going to do is do interface counter state, and then we're going to just give it value, and that is going to be of type number. We're not going to give it anything else because frankly we don't need anything else in our state. Then the next step is we need to actually create our initial state. I'm going to let Copilot here be very helpful. We have initial state, which is going to be of type counter state, and that is going to initialize the value to 0, which means that whenever we're initializing the state, it's always going to start with the value being 0. Then what we need to do is come here and create our actual slice. So I'm going to do const counter slice, and that is going to be equal to create slice, and I'm going to import this directly from Redux.js toolkit. That is going to take a parenthesis, and then it's going to take an object as a parameter. The keys that we're going to give to this object are the name. That is going to be the name of our slice, which is going to be counter. We don't want to do anything fancy, right? This is a simple name for a simple slice. Then it's going to take in an initial state, which we can just give it here initial state. That is going to be the state that this slice will start with. And then we can give it some reducers. So I'm just going to do reducers. And then for now, we're not going to have any actual reducers. So this is just going to be a simple empty object. And then we're going to come here at the bottom and do something really, really cool. I'm going to do export default counter slice dot reducer, and then save this. Essentially, because we're using create slice from Redux.js toolkit, this gives us a lot of benefits, a lot of cool things behind the scenes without us having to set up anything. Just by defining this slice here, we automatically get access to a reducer, which we're exporting here by doing counter slice.reducer. This is only available because we're using create slice from Redux.js toolkit, and it's doing a lot of the magic for us. If we weren't to use this, we would have had to do a lot more boilerplate code to achieve the same functionality. So now with this, we've efficiently and easily exported the reducer as the default export of this file, which means that we can now come here to our store where we defined our store and we had this empty reducer key here, and we can import that reducer that we just created. So I'm going to come here and do import counter reducer from, and that's going to be dot counter slash counter slice. Essentially, this is the reducer that we just exported here as the default export. Then inside of this reducer object here, instead of it being empty, I'm going to do counter reducer. And now we've essentially connected the counter slice to our store, which is then going to be accessible using this provider to our entire React application. The beauty of setting it up this way is that you can have as many slices as you want. As we've seen before, right? We had the counter state here, we had the user state, we can have any number of states. We would just create a slice for each of those states. They would have their own individual slices of state, and very soon we're going to see actions and reducers, and then you can just combine all of them here, which makes it really, really easy to have separation of concerns. Each slice is responsible for its own state and nothing else, and it makes everything really organized and really, really easy to work with. Cool, so now let's actually build some actions and reducers. Now, Redux Toolkit makes this really, really simple. The only thing that we need to do to create both a reducer and an action is just define a reducer here. So I'm going to make a new line here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do increment, and that is going to be our reducer. And reducers, they always take a state as a parameter, and then they will just return here. And let me just see if Copilot can do it. Yes, it can. So reducers, you have to define them by a name. You have to give them a key, and then they will always take a state. And optionally, if I can just type properly, my keyboard is really hard to get used to, they will also take here an action. But this is optional. This doesn't always need to happen because it can happen in the case of increment, for example, where you don't actually need to use anything from the action. You just know that you have an increment and you just need to update the state to +1. So in this case, specifically for the increment reducer, we're just not going to give this because this is going to be an unused property. Now, there's something really interesting that I want you to pay attention to because this is super important. Remember how in the beginning of the video, I said that Redux, you never mutate the state directly. You always make a copy to the state and then you replace the entire state with it. Well, here it seems that this increment reducer will take the state and then will directly assign state.value plus equals 1. Isn't this directly mutating the state? Is this a mistake? Well, no, this isn't a mistake, but at the same time, I'm not sure how I feel about this because this can get really confusing, especially to someone that's just starting out with Redux. Essentially, what's happening is because we're using create slice from Redux Redux toolkit, as I've said, this does a lot of the magic for us behind the scenes so that we don't have to do it. And essentially what's happening here is this create slice is smart enough to know that we want to make this update to the state, so it allows us to write mutating code, right, which I put in quotes because we're not actually mutating it. And what it is going to do is behind the scenes, it's going to make its own copy of the state, apply this change to that copy, and then return to us the value, the new state, to then overwrite. This allows us to write mutating code, which makes it easier for us because we don't have to make all of those copies and manage those, but at the cost of it being a little bit confusing because it does look like we're writing mutating code. So just remember, because this is really important, you can only do this if you're using create slice from Redux. Otherwise, you cannot do this, and you would have had to make your own copy of the state and do all of that manually. But because we're using this, we don't have to do it, and it's handled automatically for us, which again, mixed feelings. It's convenient, but it's also confusing. Great. So now that we understand that, we can make our next reducer, which is going to be the decrement case. This is going to be very simple. It's going to be exactly the same thing. We're going to do decrement.
But actually,
That is also going to take the state here, and also that is going to do state.value -1. Again, because we're using create slice, we can do this and it's not going to be a problem. We're not actually going to mutate the state directly. So now these are our reducers. We've just told Redux that we have two reducers, increment and decrement, and this is how the state should update whenever we have actions that actually want to trigger those reducers. So then, how do we create those actions? Well, this is another point of the magic of Redux Toolkit. We can easily get access to the actions by just doing export const, and I'm going to let Copilot be very helpful. We're going to export const increment and decrement from counterslice.actions. So just like we were able to get access to the reducer from this counterslice using Redux Toolkit, we're also able to get the actions directly from this counter.